Hi everyone, this is Dr. Anamta, a UPSC English Literature faculty, and today we are going ahead with the second part of our Restoration to Romanticism, a very seminal work. So let's go ahead with today's lesson without any further delays. So guys, talking about the Restoration period, we left around that how the Restoration drama was brewing at that time, how it was developing into a sort of a very distinct entertainment form of entertainment. So Restoration drama, a shift from Shakespeare theatre. Shakespeare theatre had a different agenda, different ideologies to drama. Restoration was different. Why? Restoration was basically focusing on the comedy of manners. Now, what is comedy of manners? Comedy of manners is how the society behaves, and you are basically mocking them, satirizing about them, or you are somehow exhibiting their follies on the stage, wherein they realize, they get the message that yes, the joke is on them. However, it still gives a sort of a message. Okay, so that is a very strong form of Restoration drama that emerged during that time. So key difference from Shakespeare theatre: audience. Now it was large audience. The audience, because the theatres were increasing, so the now largely upper class, unlike the diverse Elizabethan audience. Okay, so the theatre were now nicely located. They were much better in architecture, and mostly who were attending, that was the upper class, and that upper class became quite a large audience. Now theatres, only 2 licensed theatre were there. Or as we know, in 1642 the theatres were completely shut. So now after once the theatres got open, only 2 theatres had the license कि हाँ आप लोग शो दिखा सकते हैं, and that is Theatre Royal, Drury Lane में था एक, and next was Duke's House at Lincoln's Inn, later moved to Covent Garden in 1732. Introduction of actresses. Now that's a very seminal point. We all know that Shakespeare के time में there were no female actors on the stage. It was all males, and they were dressed as females, and they were made to act the role of a female. All right, so that is how it was. But a very significant shift happened in the Restoration era, and that was heroines, like the female actresses. They were made to act on the stage and play a full-fledged female role. Okay, so introduction of actresses. The first recorded female performer was Mrs. Coleman, 1656 में, in Sir William Davenant's The Siege of Rhodes. So 1656, as late as 1656, if we see, that was the time period when Mrs. Coleman, she came on the stage, and you can imagine this is Mrs. Coleman, and she was on the stage who kind of acted in whose place? In Sir William Davenant's place, The Siege of Rhodes. Okay, then let's move ahead to the next slide. So adaptation and censorship of Shakespeare. No, now what happened that Shakespeare's plays were altered to fit Restoration taste. Okay, so yes, शेक्सपियर के जो प्लेस थे उनको भी शिफ्ट किया. फॉर इंस्टेंस किंग लियर को एक हैप्पी एंडिंग दे दिया था नाहमटाट ने इस टाइम पीरियड में. सो शेक्सपियर्स प्लेस वर परफॉर्म्ड बट विद अ डिफरेंट ट्विस्ट, सो दैट ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा ऑडियंस को पसंद आए, बिकॉज ऑफ कोर्स द टेस्ट हैड शिफ्टेड. So lighter, not very heavy, not something like Macbeth and Othello. So lighter, moralistic or musical versions were performed. For instance, The Tempest. The Tempest of Shakespeare, जिसमें Prospero एक seminal character है, Prospero's philosophical crisis was removed. Okay, so this, to make it light-hearted, to make it just entertaining. Dr. Faustus, Christopher Marlowe एक tragic play है. It's all about ambition, authority, power. It's about Mephistopheles and Dr. Faustus. So it was rewritten as a farce in 1697. What is a farce? It's a comical sort of a play. Nahum Tate ने adaptation किया था King Lear का, and provided a happy ending to King Lear. Okay, so King Lear में जहाँ पे King Lear अपने बेटियों से बेटी उसके he had 3 daughters. 2 of the daughters kind of just ditch him and do not betray him very badly. So that was converted into a happy ending. Lear and Cordelia survive, and Gloucester's blinding scene was removed to avoid the disturbing elements. And this censored version remains standard for about almost 200 years. So King Lear जो हम लोग अभी ओरिजिनल पढ़ते हैं, that it's a very tragic play, that is Shakespeare's. लेकिन इस time for 200 years King Lear was performed as a happy ending play. Okay, so this was of course a significant change. Then you have, this was a drama. Okay, you're getting the drama, that how the drama was at that time. So it was a very different one from what Shakespeare was still, you know, the sensibilities of the audience was still far refined, I would believe. Over here it was all about just having a good time, getting entertained, and nothing else. Okay, the restoration tragedy, the heroic tragedy. So there were tragedies that were written, but basically heroic, some जहाँ पे follies, जहाँ पे human flaws ना सामने आए, but कुछ ना कुछ वजह से tragic ending हो, and you know it is all about a heroic tragic ending. Okay, so still the hero, the protagonist who is dying emerges out as a hero, and none of the follies are exhibitingly showing. So it was very formal, and it was basically popularized by John Dryden. John Dryden used to write in heroic couplet, and that is something that was made famous. So neoclassical style, as I discussed, neoclassical style मतलब जो classical writers थे हमारे, Virgil, Horace, Homer, उनके work के ऊपर ही बन रहे थे सारे plays. So heroic tragedy is basically that sort of a play, following unity of time, place and action. So मतलब जितना भी play होता था उसका एक ही टाइम होता था, मतलब यू नो एक ही, फॉर इंस्टेंस अगर एक पीरियड ले लिया, एक बैटल होने जा रहा है, एक दिन ले लिया, तो दैट यूज्ड टू बी द टाइम. And you know period ले लिया, एक ही period होता है, and action, you know some same kind of an action is happening in act 1, act 2, act 3. This was a unity of time, place and action. John Dryden का All for Love is a quintessential example of a heroic tragedy written in 1678. It's a retelling of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. It focuses on the final hours of the protagonist, and it omits broader historical and political elements. Okay, so this became important one, restoration tragedy, the heroic couplet. You can look at the picture out here also, guys. So it's a very a kind of a tragedy in which the protagonist who is dying but still emerges out as a hero. Okay, Thomas Otway. Now talking about Thomas Otway, the major tragic playwright. So Thomas Otway was considered the major tragic playwright of that period, and he wrote The Orphan. So apart from John Dryden, Thomas Otway was one of the most important ones. 1680 में इन्होंने Orphan लिखा, and Venice Preserved in 1682. Tragedies of failure, remorse, suicide rather than ambition or revenge. So this was किसका था? Tragedies, failure का था, remorse का था, and suicide rather than ambition or revenge. So ambition, revenge, and you know power, authority, money, इन सब का जो ट्रेजेडी एंडिंग होती थी वो शेक्सपियर के टाइम पे होती थी. यहाँ पे एज आई टोल्ड यू, इट्स ट्रेजेडीज ऑफ फेलियर और रिमोर्स और समथिंग एल्स दैट इज लेस लेस पावरफुल एज कंपेयर टू दोज ट्रेजेडीज दैट वर हैपनिंग. थीम्स इन वेनिस प्रिजर्व, तो इनका जो वेनिस प्रिजर्व्ड का प्ले था थॉमस, उसमें क्या थीम थी? पॉलिटिकल लॉयल्टी over personal freedom. Okay, so at that time, guys, the politically England was very charged. So politics की तरफ से बहुत रुझाव था. Everybody was inclined towards that, and you know, so political एक play दिखाना was of course a very it was like just appeasing to the audience. All right. So Jafar, the protagonist, ultimately kills his best friend and himself to maintain the social order. Okay, so वहाँ का जो turmoil था उस time पे, उसको maintain करने के लिए, you know, so he was like the protagonist kills. Unlike Elizabethan Jacobean tragic heroes, Jafar affirms the status quo rather than questioning it. So he's like, similarly at that time there was so much of political turmoil happening that even the play is kind of projecting that, you know, it is better to kill yourself, to kill your loved one, however, let England be in peace. Okay, so this was a kind of a thing that was happening during that time. Then you have significance of restoration drama. This was a marked shift from deep tragedy to moralized and formal storytelling. It was a huge shift. Okay, something that was as a form of entertainment. Now, in a way, moralistic teaching was happening. It was light-hearted plays, emphasized order, emphasized on social harmony and noble ideals. And this set the stage for 18th century neoclassical drama and comedy. Then you have next Venice Preserved Political Tragedy by Thomas Otway. So Venice Preserved, as we just discussed, it is considered as a political tragedy. So let's talk about this a bit. Jafar, the protagonist, begins as a revolutionary who seeks revenge and freedom. Later, he becomes an outcast. Okay, so over here, as we can see, during that time, Oliver Cromwell was there. There was a revolution. Then Charles II came. There was another revolution. So a lot of revolutions were happening at that time. So over here also, Jafar begins as a revolutionary. Who he's being a revolutionary. He's bringing some revolution, mirroring what is happening during that time. Okay, so mark it as 1682, very close to what was happening during that period. Later, he became an outcast. Usko bahar kar diya gaya, outcast kar diya, abandoned by fortune and friends. Fortune's common fool, the jest of rogues and instrumental ass. Okay, that is the line that comes. Theme, Jafar and ultimately upholds a status quo rather than challenging it, unlike Elizabethan tragic heroes. Okay, so this is how at the end he kills himself, and this is how it happens, that he maintains the status quo, he does not disrupt it. Now, what happens? The rise of middle class domestic tragedy. Another sort of a play apart from heroic tragedy that was on a rise was the domestic tragedy, middle class domestic tragedy. So over here you can see this theater looks a little lesser opulent, pompous as compared to the previous theaters because it is catering to the middle class. So what were middle class domestic tragedies? So George Lilo was one of the very finest dramatists to bring domestic tragedies into onto the stage. So George Lilo brought tragedy into middle class settings. Key works George Lilo ke kaun se the London Merchant, okay, 1731. A moral tragedy about a young apprentice. So we all know that for every section of the society there are different directors or different playwrights who cater to that audience. George Lilo was catering to a middle class audience, okay, exhibiting their realities on stage. So the London Merchant of George Lilo was a moral tragedy about a young apprentice, okay, so about a young boy. The Fatal Curiosity, another of his play, written in 1736. This was based on Arden of Faversham, featuring Wilmot and Agnes, a desperate couple driven to murder for wealth. Agnes manipulates Wilmot in a scene that is reminiscent of Macbeth. Okay, so Macbeth का थोड़ा सा इसमें झलक आ रहा था, इसमें थोड़ा सा reflection आ रहा था. And this is how, tragic twist, they unknowingly kill their own son. Okay, so this must have been a very difficult sort of a scene, I'm sure. And original title kya hai iska? Guilt, its own punishment. Okay, so it's a kind of a self-explanatory that itna guilt tha unke andar, that the guilt, that if you have guilt of doing something wrong in your life, then that's your own punishment. You create a hell within yourself, right? So influenced Lilo's tragedies shaped European drama and inspiring Albert Camus. So Albert Camus, 1945. Okay, modern agar log era mein dekhe, so that was his inspiration. George Lilo inspired Albert Camus. Now that's a huge thing. Okay, so this happened during that time. Middle class plays were kind of on a rise, especially by George Lilo. Then we are coming to Restoration comedy, the comedy of manners. So what did we look at? We looked at heroic tragedies. We looked at that plays that were light-hearted, sad ending, tragic endings were converting into happy ones, trying to suit the mood of that period. Then there were middle class tragedies, and now we are coming to comedy of manners. This Restoration period is primarily known for comedy of manners. What is comedy of manners? As I mentioned to you, main themes, comedy of manners की main themes होती थी sexual intrigues, okay, seduction and social ambition. So there was obscenity, there was vulgarity on the stage, and maybe that was one of the reasons that it was very different to what had ever been portrayed on the stage. And this is the reason कि comedy of manners में इतना ज़्यादा popularize हो गया था. And it was all about one boy loving the other girl, that girl loving someone else, and that girl trying to woo someone else. So this all was a very sort of a complicated play, but everything was humorous, okay, and also bringing out the follies of the society. So satirizes the upper class aristocracy and their excesses, characters that are obsessed with fashion, gossip, and reputation. Now, this is something that kind of sums up the entire Restoration comedy of manners. That over here, the characters were all about, gossip ke uski zindagi mein kya chal raha hai, fashion, okay, that how they used to dress up in that manner, ke everything was all about fashion, and reputation, कि किसी की reputation ना खराब हो जाए. Okay, sounds very similar to our society also, is it? Okay, so key differences from earlier comedy, unlike Shakespeare comedies, which explored love, philosophy, and wit. As I tell you, the sensibilities were much sharper and finer during Shakespeare period as compared to the Restoration period. Why? Because यहाँ पे वहाँ पे philosophy पे work हो रहा है. वहाँ पे अगर फूल भी एक jocks भी अगर कुछ बोल रहा है, तो that's it's more philosophical in its tendency. However, over here it is more like little crass, I would say that. Okay, so and over here, Restoration comedy is purely about amusement and scandals. Okay, मतलब के ये scandal हो गया, वो controversy हो गई, and all that. That was about it. So it lacks Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson Shakespeare period के थे. It lacks Ben Jonson moral critique or John Bunyan's religious seriousness. Okay, so it did not have any moralistic tendency to it. However, because Ben Jonson भी comedy of manners लिखता था, लेकिन उसके plays में कुछ सीखने को मिलता था. यहाँ पे it was just about scandal, entertainment, controversy, that's all. And strong contrast between innocent country life versus corrupt city life. Then you have stock female characters, predatory young widows. Okay, so stock female characters, जिसमें कोई भी, there used to be no significant change in their attitudes. So stock female characters, predatory young widows looking for lovers, aging aristocratic women desperate for attention. Okay, so can you see, मतलब के stock characters, हर play में almost इसी तरह के characters होते थे. Nothing apart from that, nothing, not any कोई भी और dimension था नहीं character में, no. Okay, so predatory young widows, aging aristocratic, predatory young widows matlab young widows trying to find some other man to get married to. Okay, so this kind of a thing was there. Key Restoration comedies: Aphra Behn's The Rover, 1677 to 1681, a comedy of action, adventure, and seduction. George Etheridge Katha, The Man of Mode, 1676 mein, again a witty satire on fashionable London society. The Comical Revenge, another one, and this was by George Etheridge. Okay, so guys, George Etheridge, William Congreve, and George Farquhar, abhi hum log sab padhenge. These were mainly the Restoration, comedy of manners playwrights, and of them, William Congreve was the best. Okay, he was very popular. इनके बहुत plays होते थे, so we'll see to that. So Comical Revenge by George Etheridge क्या था? It blends tragedy, revenge with city comedy, love, class, and money. Features a very rich widow, stock character bhi humne padha, features a rich widow, a foolish country knight, okay, a nobleman who is stupid, foolish, and a cunning valet, okay, a forerunner of later Restoration comedy troupes. So, okay, over here you can look at this, guys. It was different in its style also, manners also, and everything. Now coming to Restoration theatre, a period of diversity and experimentation. So this era saw intense debate on comedy, okay, tragedy, realism, and theatrical representation. This was second only to the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods in range and variety, and French and Italian influences blended with older city comedy traditions. You know why French influence was there? Because in 1660, Charles II जब आए थे वो फ्रांस से आए थे. With him, he brought significant level of French influence with him. And this kind of showed in the plays, in the Restoration comedies, actually vividly exhibited. Significance of Restoration drama: tragedy became more political and moralistic rather than existential. Okay, so existential जो होता है ना, जैसे कि हम लोग क्यों आए इस दुनिया में, क्या purpose है हमारा, why have we come? Apart from that, so ये तो नहीं था क्योंकि ये शेक्सपियरियन के एरा में बहुत था. This time it became more political and more moralistic. Comedy embraced scandal, wit, and the frivolous lives of the elite, and it set the stage for later 18th century satire and neoclassical drama. Then you have the evolution of comedy from social satire to criticism. George Etheridge comedy. Now we're coming to George Etheridge comedy because he was one of the foremost playwrights of the comedy of manners. She Would If She Could. Up नामी देखो titles के. She Would If She Could, 1668, and The Man of Mode, 1676. This focused on town versus country manners, मतलब कि town manners, city manners versus village rustic थोड़ा rural area के manners, satirical contrast between youth, age, men and women, the foppish excesses of characters like Sir Fopling Flutter. Look at the name, Sir Fopling Flutter. Okay, Milament, Mirabelle, Wishful, Sir Wishful. इस तरह के नाम होते थे. Wilmont. Okay, so in a way, those names which kind of tell the character only. All right. So Sir Fopling Flutter, who's obsessed with fashion and his own reflection. So this is Sir Fopling Flutter. Okay. Okay, so we do have Sir Fopling Flutter in this world also, in our times also. So this is Sir Fopling Flutter. And William Wycherley. William Wycherley was another Restoration dramatist, The Country Wife, written 1675. And this is seen as the most obscene and amoral Restoration comedies. इनका main plot क्या था? Hona pretends to be important to seduce married women. Okay, this was a plot. Okay, Mrs. Pinchwife, naive and eager for city life, believes adultery is normal in London. Okay, so adultery वहाँ पे तो होगी उस time पे rampant होगा. So kind of trying to show that also, but making it in a comic play. Okay, so that was something that was happening. William Wycherley. All right. Then moving ahead, the backlash against Restoration comedy. Now there was so much of vulgarity, obscenity, such kind of themes were being projected. Do you think that there will not be opposition? Of course there was opposition. So the criticism of the theatre grows in the late 1600s significantly. They were like, "Hum log kya dikha rahe hain? Why are we showing so much of vulgarity on the stage?" So Jeremy Collier ने एक लिखा था, short view of the immorality and profaneness of the English stage, 1698 में लिखा था. This attacked the theatre for mocking clergy, excessive profanity and sexual content, echoed Puritan criticism from the previous century. His impact was enormous. Writers and actors were fined and prosecuted. The king issued a royal order. इतना powerful इसका pamphlet हो गया था, writing हो गया था, that writers and actors were fined, they were prosecuted. That why did you do that? The king issued a royal order banning the plays contrary to religion and good manners, and censorship became official within 40 years. And censorship फिर और आ गई थी बहुत तेजी से in the next 40. तभी तो फिर से ड्रामा का काफी decline होता है. And this is how it was kind of trying, it was to be controlled because it was going in another direction. It was actually becoming very, very obscene. So now the last masterpiece of Restoration comedy, लेकिन जाते जाते Restoration comedy ने कुछ last masterpieces दिए थे. And unlike the other plays, like if she stooped to conquer and all that, she would if she could, instead of showing a lot of vulgarity on the stage, it was more little kind of manners were little more refined. Okay, तो मतलब वो ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा society के बारे में था, इतना obscenity नहीं था. So the last masterpiece, despite censorship, some of the greatest comedies emerged, and that is, as I mentioned, William Congreve, The Way of the World, 1700 ka, is considered the quintessential, the most significant comedy of manners of the Restoration period. It is actually funny. If you read the play, I've read the play, it's very funny, it's very intriguing. So इसमें क्या होता है कि the pinnacle of Restoration comedy, Sir John Vanbrugh and George Farquhar, ये दो अलग playwrights थे. They continued the tradition but adapted to changing the taste. And George Farquhar का The Boo Stratagem, 1707, was his final work before dying at the age of 30. Okay, so this became an important one. Then you have The Way of the World. Let's talk about The Way of the World, जो William Congreve का 1700 play में किया गया था play. It's a very witty satire marriage, and whenever you talk about Restoration era and Restoration comedy, you definitely talk about William Congreve. You cannot not talk about it. Okay, so Milament versus Mirabelle. Okay, so Milament और Mirabelle ये दोनों protagonist हैं, and Milament rejects traditional married life, setting her own humorous terms for marriage. So Milament is the girl and Mirabelle is the boy. Mirabelle is in love with Milament, लेकिन Milament ना एक शर्तें रखती, conditions रखती कि if I get married to you, then I will do this, I will do that, you will have to do this. Okay, it's a very modern sort of a play. And she refuses to be called wife, spouse, sweetheart. Okay, so kind of एक तरह का satire है on how things were happening during that time. Avoiding stale affection. Okay, something बहुत ज़्यादा superficial affection. She wants freedom to visit friends. She wears what she likes, and she maintains personal space. Okay, this was unlike the women who had the freedom to do all these things, but Mila Ment was setting all these boundaries for her. And the play satirizes the social expectations of marriage and restoration comedy. So you can see Mila Ment and Mirabelle. Okay, so these are the two that they were in love. Then you have the shift towards sentimental comedy is early 1700s. Now from now there was of course license was happening. So अब इतना ज़्यादा like monarch ने भी king ने भी इतना interfere कर दिया था. So what was happening was that अब ना इतना comedy of manners को control करके what was coming was shift towards sentimental comedy. Okay, so there was significant shift towards sentimental comedy early 1700s में. And just a second, guys. So now what happened during that period? Restoration comedy faded as new middle class values took over. Okay, audiences now began to prefer moral sentimental plays instead of this crass these kind of plays that just showed such a kind of profaneness on the stage. Censorship ensured that theatre became more proper, more restrained, more controlled, and not exhibiting something that is not very moral. Okay, significance of the period: restoration comedy defined the excesses and wit of aristocratic life, and फिर जब वो decline हुआ है, its decline marked the rise of the middle class. This is a very important point कि जैसे restoration comedy का downfall हुआ था ना, in a way aristocracy का भी downfall हुआ था, because restoration comedy was basically catering to the elite class. However, जब sentimental comedy का rise हुआ है ना, so that means that yes, the middle class is rising. And look at the period. What period it was? It was the early 18th century. Okay, so Congreve ka The Way of the World remains the best example of restoration comedy, and most like commonly you can say the last of the restoration comedies. Okay, so this was it. So then you have William Congreve, social depth and wit. So let's talk about William Congreve a bit. So when we talk about him, more than just satire, his characters, जिसके characters होते हैं जैसे Mila Ment, Mirabelle, and there was a Fainall and so many other characters. So his characters reflect real social and emotional pressures. This is the reason when you show something that's real and that kind of mirrors the society, then that strikes with the audience the most. Congreve, as an outsider, he was born in Ireland, and this is the reason maybe he had a good lens to see what is happening in England. He had a different lens as compared to all other people. So which may have given him a sharp observational perspective. So when you are from the outside, you're able to see it more clearly. His most famous play, The Way of the World, 1700, captures social negotiation in marriage. Okay, so this is something that happened. Then you have Sir John Vanbrugh, outrageous comedy and satire. Sir John Vanbrugh is another one, जो कि it was outrageous comedy and satire. How outrageous? इनका जो play था The Relapse 1696 में and The Provoked Wife in 1697 में both scandalized critics like Jeremy Collier, and they were rich, exaggerated characters, just Sir Novelty Fashion, Sir Tunbilly Clumsy, Lady Fanciful, Lord Foppington. Can you look at the names? These kind of names which were self-explanatory what the character is like. So this was Sir John Vanbrugh doing the best. So example scene, Loveless, a character whose name is Loveless. He seduces Berenthea despite her weak protest, and playfully it exaggerated themes of power and desire in male fashion dynamics. Okay, so you can look at this play, this slide. Then you have George Farquhar. George Farquhar was little more realistic. Okay, just a recruiting officer likha tha, a more realistic play. So George Farquhar, a more realistic and human comedy. So his plays explored human motivation rather than just upper class antiques. Okay, rather than just कि upper class कितना scandalous है, कितना ज़्यादा frivolous है, कितना ज़्यादा controversies में घिरा रहता है, उससे ज़्यादा it was more about that human motivation rather than just frivolous elite class comedy. The Recruiting Officer, उनका जो 1706 में जो play आया था, ये reflect करता है the ongoing war of the Spanish succession. Okay, The Boo Stratagem 1707 में this shifts from London's elite to country town settings. Mrs. Sullen, उनका character जो था, Mrs. Sullen's attraction to Archer is a more emotional, humanized romantic comedy scene. So you can see maybe this looks a little more human. ज़्यादा बहुत scandalous नहीं लग रहा है, थोड़ा सा humanized लग रहा है. So this was George Farquhar, the recruiting officer. Then you have Susanna Centlever, woman and social satire. So we also had women playwrights who were also successful, who were also doing a good job and having showing, exhibiting good plays. So one of the most successful female playwrights of the 1700 and a bold stroke for a wife. 1718 किसने लिखा है ये? Susanna Centlever. Susanna Centlever, woman and social satirist. So she combines romantic intrigue, battle of the sexes, sharp satire on religious hypocrisy, and so on. So seen this disguised as a Quaker, a clever plot devised for deception and social critique. So there was, social critique was also there through a social satirist beat. So that was, when you talk about society in that manner, that brings a huge difference because people, as I mentioned, they are able to relate to that play. Then you have the fall of restoration comedy and the rise of the moral censorship. So as we talked about, पहले के जेरेमी कॉलियर का जो आया था, a short view on the profaneness on the English stage, now that was a seminal, a watershed event, क्योंकि इसने रोक दिया था बहुत ज़्यादा जो restoration comedy में हो रहा था. Okay, so George उसका Jeremy Collier short view of the profane of the stage. This condemned sexual innuendo, sexual messages that were happening, profanity and mockery of religion. This led to censorship laws, comedies became less scandalous, and royal censorship and moral backlash. Theatre gradually shifted towards sentimental comedy, as we just discussed, we'll see to that abhi, and less wit and satire and more moral lessons. So we know that Jeremy Collier की वजह से sentimental comedy आ गया था because things kind of started reducing the kind of comedic manners was so explicit, थोड़ा implicit होने लगा था. Significance of late restoration comedy. So William Congreve, Van Brugh, George Farquhar, Centlever, they all defined the last phase of the restoration wit. Restoration wit का last phase दिखाया इन्होंने, इनको कहते हैं कि the last playwrights of the restoration era, and shifted from aristocratic mockery to deeper, more human storytelling. Okay, हो गया, superficiality बहुत हो गई, अब थोड़ा deeper level पे आ गए थे, and this signaled the transition towards the 18th century sentimental drama, and which was on a significant rise. Then you have causes of drama's decline. Jeremy Collier, as I mentioned, very important. Then the middle class were rising. The middle classes turned to prose, journals. Now we will see in the 18th century novel, the genre that had not developed at all will be developing now. This is the reason also कि drama decline हो गया क्योंकि novels आ गए थे. Novels एक solitary exercise होती है guys, wherein you are sitting all alone, you are reading. जरूरी नहीं आप बहुत सबके साथ बैठ के entertain हो. Novels आपको entertainment मिलता है ना, चुपचाप बैठ के पढ़ लो. So that kind of was coming. And why was that coming? Because middle class was increasing, literacy was increasing. Okay, so middle classes turned to prose, journals and newspapers for entertainment and social discourse. Farce and musical plays became dominant. तो जब journals आ गए, ये सब आप कर सकते हो, तो musical plays जहाँ पे music होती थी, song, dance, all that became important, pushing serious drama into the background. Okay, so drama पीछे चला गया. Now the Beggar's Opera, a revolutionary theatrical work. Now Beggar's Opera में बहुत songs थे, गाना था, dance था, तो this was very famous at that time. John Gay का The Beggar's Opera 1728, and this was John Gay का satirical Newgate Pastoral. Newgate Pastoral मतलब क्या था? Newgate एक जेल का नाम था. उसके उस टाइम पे बहुत ही फेमस जेल, जितने भी prisoners होते थे Newgate में रहते थे. So the Beggar's Opera उसी से related था. So Newgate Prison as a setting. So उसमें Beggar's Opera में जो Newgate Prison था, उसको एक जेल का उसको setting बनाया गया था. A gritty contrast to traditional pastoral themes. It blended elements of city comedy भी था, ballet भी था उसमें, and it was a political satire also. इसने mock किया था the fashionable Italian opera style. तो opera कहाँ से आया? इटली से आया, तो उसने उसको mock किया था, अपने level का बनाया था. And then there is a scene, इसी Beggar's Opera में एक scene है between Polly Peachum and Machete. Okay, दो characters हैं, Polly Peachum and Machete. A twist on romantic dialogues, and Machete swears fidelity. Machete कहता है Polly Peachum से that I will always be very loyal to you, but the audience knows that he is a rogue, and the audience knows Polly Peachum को नहीं पता है वो कितना disloyal है. but the audience knows about it. So Polly is very naive, very innocent girl, and she's making the scene a mix of sentimentality and irony. Okay, so of course, when somebody is promising that I'll be always loyal to you, and the audience knows कि नहीं वो तो थोड़ा sentimental तो होगा play. Okay, so this became immensely popular and influential. Later inspired works like Bertolt Brecht, the Three Penny Opera. 1928 में Bertolt Brecht एक बहुत important playwright थे, उन्हीं से भी inspired हुआ था ये वाला. He also got inspired from this. Then Censorship and Theatres Licensing Act 1737. फिर से 1737 में licensing act आया था. सर रॉबर्ट वॉलपोल जो कि उस टाइम पे बहुत फेमस प्राइम मिनिस्टर थे इंग्लैंड के. So he was angered by the political satire in the Beggars Opera. अब जब जॉन गे का Beggars Opera ने इतना strongly political satire भेजा, रॉबर्ट वॉलपोल got very angry. He was like, what is this happening? And Henry Fielding, the Historical Register, और Henry Fielding का एक और कोई tract आया होगा, उसका नाम है The Historical Tragedy Register for 1736. Now Robert Walpole got very angry and he enforced strict censorship through the Theatres Licensing Act in 1737. Up more, stoppage to drama. Effects of this act, the Lord Chamberlain, जो एक कंपनी थी एक्टर्स की, that became the official censor granting or refusal play license. तो लॉर्ड चेम्बरमैन को रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी देगा कि आप लोग प्ले देखेंगे एंड अगर वो सूटेबल होगा सोसाइटी के लिए, समाज के लिए, तो ही दिखाया जाएगा, वरना नहीं दिखाया जाएगा. And all political plays were banned political criticism and sexual themes. They were completely banned, that you cannot show anything sexual, you cannot show anything that's political. Fielding abandoned drama and turned to novels. Over here, as I told you, कि अब novels आते, अब dramatists ना, they were like drama में तो नहीं कर सकते, चलो हम लोग अपने novels में कर ले. तो Henry Fielding ने novels लिखना शुरू किया. Gulliver's Travel, again a political satire. ये Henry Fielding का बहुत important work है. Okay, so Henry Fielding abandoned drama, moved to novels, and leading to masterpieces like Tom Jones and Gulliver's Travels and so on. Theatrical debates was silenced until the 19th century. Sorry guys, Jonathan Swift का है Gulliver's Travels, Henry Fielding का है Tom Jones, Henry Fielding का, and then there is the Huckleberry Finn. ये सारे Fielding के हैं, and the act remained in force until 1968. So Jonathan Swift was also a very important playwright. And Jonathan Swift का जो Gulliver's Travel, that's a very strong political satire. It's a novel and it's a very strong political satire. I'm sure a lot of people must have read this. So now significance of the period, theatre lost its role as a vehicle for social and political debate. The novel emerged as the new dominant literary form. So what are we seeing, and how did we see that the novel emerged? Itne licenses हुए that ultimately the novel emerged as the new dominant form. Censorship reshaped English drama, restricting it for over 2 centuries. Okay, so itna zyada drama control कर दिया गया था. John Wilmot, that was Earl of Rochester, the scandalous poet of the Restoration period. Rochester, if you talk about Rochester, then Rochester, his name was John Wilmot. He was basically Earl of Rochester and a very scandalous poet. So Rochester, as the embodiment of Restoration excess, lived a very notorious hedonistic life, and he embraced drunkenness, sexual adventures of all kinds. There was sharp wit and satire against both morality and reason. His deathbed conversion to religion is debated. Some see it as a genuine repentance. Others believe it was a myth-making by Chaplin. And also Earl of Rochester was a very, infamous sort of a poet at that time, who was, amoral activities, sexual activities and so on. That was on a rise. So Rochester की poetry अगर हम लोग देखें, Rochester की poetry is a bridge between literary movements. So why is Rochester important? Why? Because इसका जो poetry था, that acts as a bridge between literary movement. It connects several traditions like metaphysical poets like John Donne, philosophical reflection, Cavalier poets, playful love lyrics. Okay, metaphysical poets की तरह भी लिखता था, Cavalier poets की भी तरह लिखता था. Augustan satirist, biting social criticism भी था. So अगर मेरे previous videos देखें, I've talked a lot about metaphysical, Cavalier, so how they were writing, he was kind of writing in that manner. Themes and style, love and loss, इनका theme था. Sexual humor भी आता था. Satirical self-mockery and harsh critique of humanity. So Rochester's poetry was so diverse, so vast, and this kind of shifted as a link between the shifting trends of that literary period. Okay, so this is Earl of Rochester. Okay, you can see that. So Rochester connection to restoration comedy agar dekha jaye, what it was basically, and we see that he shares a theme with restoration playwrights, mocks rationality. इसने अपोज किया था द सेल्फ कॉन्ग्रेचुलेटरी रैशनलिज्म ऑफ द ऑगस्टिन एज, रैशनैलिटी को मॉक करता था. He revels in vice while acknowledging its consequences, and human folly ko observes human folly with humor, with cynicism, and of course a very worldly, very tolerant. So he used to bring that kind of a folly onto the stage, depicting human flaws. Key similarities between Rochester and Restoration comedy: both celebrate excess while exposing its absurdity. तो क्या था कि both were trying to show the excesses and उसका जो absurdity थी उसको दिखाते थे. Satire is highly topical. सबसे ज़्यादा important satire था इनके work में, focusing on specific people, the political climate, the social political situation at that time, events and behaviors. It was less focused on universal truths, more on the self-referential world of the elite. Okay, so self-referential world, matlab is something that how they were kind of within themselves, and how things were moving in that society, in that elite class. Everything was not very, transparent. So the shift in society and literature, the world was now becoming more contained and inward looking. Okay, satire and comedy turned into self-referential elite. And unlike all the grand explorations of previous centuries, Restoration literature was cynical, self-aware, and highly personal. It was less philosophical, more immediate and topical. Significant of Rochester's legacy, and a literary rebel. So we talk about Earl of Rochester. He was a literary rebel who defied poetic conventions. He blended elegance with vulgarity, with wit, with world weariness, and he critiqued the very rationalism and morality that defined later literature, and he set the stage for later satirists like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. So if we talk about poetry, then Earl of Rochester was the one who kind of bridged the gap, okay, between the late 17th century to the early 18th century. तो मतलब जो gap था उसको उसने bridge किया था, and so that is the reason that Earl of Rochester becomes important when we talk about poetry, what was happening in poetry, because अभी poetry भी पढ़ना है हमें देखना है Alexander Pope और Jonathan Swift कैसा लिख रहे थे. Okay, so guys, with this I'm coming to an end of my lecture of the Restoration to Romanticism. The second part, third part would be coming very soon. I hope you all like the lecture, and make sure that if you want to go ahead regarding the course, the link is given in the description box. You can follow it and you can ask any questions that you want. Thank you everyone. Have a very good day.